Hi guys! So with the last book that I read and finished earlier this week, I also finished my journey through the work of the Malaysian author Tan Twan Eng, which is less impressive than it might at first sound because he only has 2 novels out this far. But both of these novels I was very impressed with, and one of them I count among my all-time favorites, in fact. So I thought that this would be a good opportunity to shine a spotlight on him and his novels. I read and loved his second novel, The Garden of Evening Mists, a few years ago, after I came across it quite randomly in a display at Waterstones. And even though straight after finishing this one, I went and bought his first novel, it took me about 4 years to finally pick it up, and I'm so glad I finally remembered how much I wanted to read it and picked it up last week or so. This was The Gift of Rain, his first novel. Tan Twan Eng is a Malaysian author, like I said, and he's of Chinese descent, and Tan is the family name. Both of his novels are historical novels that are told from the perspective of an aged protagonist in the now, or I think The Garden of Evening Mists is actually, the frame narrative is actually set in the 1980s. In both books, the narrators are reminiscing about a formative time during their youth and about the events and people that shaped them. And both books are therefore steeped in feelings of loss and yearning, both for the people that the narrators knew and loved and lost, and for the way of life that they lost, and for the lost future that they might have had if events had been just a little bit different. Both books deal with the history of Malaya, as it was then called, during the Second World War, and in particular with the Japanese occupation of the country and with the war crimes committed by the Japanese. It deals with the events, but also with the resulting political climate and the particular ramifications that the occupation had in this multicultural society of Malaya, which was made up by so many different ethnic groups. The Gift of Rain does so in a bit more detail, because in The Garden of Evening Mists, the main storyline is actually set after the Second World War, when the country is still picking up the pieces, but has also begun its long and complicated journey of independence from Britain. And it is in a latent state of civil war between the political majority and those who wanted to see different ideas realized, and are continuing a guerrilla war that began before the occupation and was refined during the war. The story in here that is being told by the aged protagonist is that in 1949, the protagonist, as a young woman, seeks out a Japanese man who used to work for the Emperor of Japan as his gardener, but came to Malaya before the occupation and has stayed on after the war. She seeks him out because she means to ask him to design a garden for her in Kuala Lumpur as a memorial for her sister, who died in the Japanese prisoner of war camp where they were both interned. A bit paradoxically, the sister found comfort during that time in the thought and memory of the Japanese gardens that she saw during a visit to Japan, and which reminded her of the existence of beauty and peace in a world where atrocious war crimes were being committed every day by the same people who built these gardens. The gardener refuses the protagonist her request, but he offers to take her on as an apprentice instead, so that she can design the memorial garden herself. And so she becomes the student of a man whom she perceives, at least at first, as a representative of the people that tortured her and who murdered her sister. And she immerses herself in his culture and his philosophy, while all around them a civil war, a guerrilla war is being waged, and people are lynched almost on a daily basis. So the book deals with the themes of trauma and healing and of forgiveness and redemption, and of how these things can be done after a devastation like a war and an occupation during wartime. And it's also just simply an incredibly well orchestrated story, which culminates in the resolution of a puzzle that you didn't even realize was there in the first place. It quite took me by surprise because I didn't expect that. At the end, it's like the pieces of a chess game are coming together for the final move, but you didn't even know that they were being placed in the first place. Or maybe it's almost like a Japanese garden whose different elements all come together at its completion and create a meaningful pattern that you didn't see while it was still being assembled, or if you're only standing in one small corner of the garden. That's pretty neat, I think. The Gift of Rain, I have to say it's much less accomplished, both in concept and structure and in writing style, imagery, etc. But it still left a very deep impression. This one is set in Penang on the west coast of Malaysia, or of Malaya as it was called when the story takes place, and it follows the life, the fate, and the coming of age journey of the son of a wealthy British merchant and a Chinese mother, who also, just before the beginning of the occupation, takes up Aikido and Zen practice under the tutelage of a Japanese diplomat, with whom he also develops a deep relationship, which in fact seems to continue a relationship that they both had during a previous lifetime. So when the occupation begins, the protagonist is expected to take sides. But how can he do that? How can he choose between his family, or his families, in fact, because he has these double ties to the Chinese and to the English population? How can he choose between either of them and the man who has become the center of his life in recent years? So his loyalties are divided, or you could also frame it positively. He is able to see the different ethnic and political groups as not monolithic, and not as monolithic enemies, but as made up of individuals who are all, or many of them, fighting their own desperate battles for survival and are often in quite the same emotional turmoil. And the book is the story of how he navigates all of that. Both books, I think, are exceptional in that they are both unflinching looks at war crimes committed in Southeast Asia during World War II. And those have only been really brought to public attention in recent decades. So books like these still feel like milestones. And they are also both exceptional, I think, in how they advocate for a differentiated view of the situations and the characters of the people involved, without ever being apologetic about anything. The Garden of Evening Mists is, like I said, masterfully conceived and executed. And The Gift of Rain, I think, is remarkable in how it steadfastly refuses to become a riveting hero's story with a redemption arc that wraps up neatly at the end and resolves everything once and for all for the protagonist. Instead, it is realistic and so much more meaningful because of it. Of course, there are also negative aspects. There's quite a bit of classism going on in the books, and Tan's characters are always rich and distinguished and always plagued by evil communists. There's this conflation going on of communism and terrorism, which you often get with authors from countries where there has been terrorism under the communist flag. Both books also romanticize certain aspects of life in Malaya. Apart from their experiences during the occupation, the protagonists actually lead quite charmed, romantic, privileged lives and come from very privileged backgrounds, so that ties in with the latent classism. The Gift of Rain seems to lag a little bit in focus, and its Buddhist spiritual themes get quite cheesy at the end. And I'm not sure if I can ever forgive the author that awful katana sword double entendre that was clearly not meant to be funny, but I just had to laugh about it, or I would have cried from the pain of it. And on a more serious note, I'm also not sure about the helpfulness and the validity of some of the Buddhist teachings in the context of war and war crimes. Some yes, but others not so much. But I can't get into that right now. Obviously, you would have had to have read the books for that. So no, the books aren't perfect, but they are very, very good, especially The Garden of Evening Mists, and I recommend starting with this one. If you'd like to sample Tan Twan Eng's writing, there is an episode in The Garden of Evening Mists that is completely disconnected from the rest of the story, so contains no spoilers whatsoever, and it was in fact first published as a short story. And you can listen to Tan Twan Eng himself read this episode in a podcast episode of the BBC 4 Around the World book club, which I will link down below. It's a story about two kamikaze pilots, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. And there is also now a movie adaptation of The Garden of Evening Mists, which came out in 2020. However, I'm not sure if I should even link you to the trailer, because I don't think the trailer gives you a very good idea of what this story is about. And from the trailer, it looks like they made the story into much more of a romance than it is in the book. The book is not a romance at all. It is, to a certain degree, a love story, but definitely not a romance. And in the trailer, it looks like this is its main focus. So I don't think that I'm going to link the trailer below, but you can, of course, Google it. So I hope that I could persuade you to pick up one of these books, or both of them, if you haven't already. And I wish you all a very happy weekend, a happy reading weekend, happy Easter weekend, and I hope you're staying safe and as well as can be. Bye, guys.